Hello and welcome to today's story. My name is Josh, and I like to dive deep into scary Asian stories and cover them in my videos. If you have an interesting story you want me to cover, let me know in the comments. I always read all comments. For now, let's get into today's video where we have a few terrifying stories to share. One of them is this story. Marcus Chen had been in Taiwan for only 3 days when he made the decision that would haunt him forever. He was a professional photographer from Seattle, 32 years old, specializing in urban architecture in the forgotten corners of cities that most tourists never saw. His portfolio thrived on images of decay, narrow passages, and the kind of atmospheric shots that told stories without words. Tainan had been recommended to him by another photographer he met in Taipei, someone who mentioned the old district with its maze-like alleys and traditional architecture that hadn't changed in decades. What Marcus didn't know was that some places resist being documented, that some cities have boundaries invisible to outsiders, boundaries that should never be crossed after dark. Marcus arrived in Tainan on a Tuesday afternoon in late October. The air was humid, thick with the smell of incense and street food, and the city felt alive in a way that made his fingers itch to start shooting. He checked into a small guest house near the old district, dropped his bags, and immediately headed out with his camera. The guest house owner, an elderly woman with gray hair pulled into a tight bun, had tried to tell him something as he left, her hand reaching out as if to stop him. But Marcus barely understood Mandarin, and his Taiwanese was non-existent. He smiled, nodded politely, and stepped into the street, the weight of his Canon around his neck feeling reassuring and familiar. The first 2 days were perfect. He photographed temples with their elaborate carvings, captured the way afternoon light filtered through the gaps between buildings, and documented the daily rhythms of local life with the respect and distance of someone who understood he was a guest. But by the third day, Marcus felt he hadn't found what he was looking for yet. He wanted something rawer, something that felt untouched by the modern world. That evening, as the sun began to set and the sky turned the color of bruised fruit, he decided to venture deeper into the old district than he had gone before. The alleys of Tainan's old district were not like streets in western cities. They were organic, winding things that seemed to have grown rather than been planned, each one leading to 3 or 4 others, creating a web of narrow passages that confused even locals if they weren't paying attention. Marcus entered the maze just as the last light was fading, his camera ready, his mind focused on composition and shadow. The first alley was perhaps 4 feet wide, flanked by walls of weathered brick and concrete that bore the stains of decades of rain and humidity. Small shrines sat in alcoves, their red paint faded, offerings of fruit and incense left by residents who still believed in appeasing the spirits that lived in old places. Marcus photographed everything, moving deeper, turning left, then right, then left again, each turn taking him further from the main roads and the sounds of traffic. He didn't notice when the sounds of the city began to fade, when the distant hum of scooters and conversation disappeared entirely, leaving only the sound of his own footsteps and breathing. He didn't notice when the alleys began to feel colder, when the air took on a quality that made his skin prickle. What he did notice was the perfect shot, a narrow passage that curved away into darkness, the walls covered in peeling posters and graffiti that looked decades old. He raised his camera, adjusted the ISO for the low light, and pressed the shutter. The flash illuminated the alley for a fraction of a second, and in that moment, Marcus saw something that made his breath catch. At the far end of the passage, perhaps 30 feet away, there was a figure standing perfectly still facing him. It was too dark to make out details, but the shape was distinctly human, and it hadn't been there a moment before. Marcus lowered his camera slowly, his heart beginning to beat faster. He called out in English, asking if the person was okay, if they needed help, but there was no response. The figure remained motionless, and the silence in the alley felt oppressive, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Marcus took a step forward, then another. his journalist instincts overriding the growing unease in his gut. He raised his camera again, zoomed in as much as the lens would allow, and took another photo. This time when the flash fired, the figure was gone. The alley was empty, just weathered walls and shadows. But Marcus could have sworn he heard footsteps running away, the sound echoing strangely, coming from multiple directions at once. He stood there for a long moment, trying to rationalize what he had seen. It was just someone who had been startled by the flash, who had ducked into one of the side passages. That made sense. That was logical. But his hands were shaking slightly as he reviewed the photos on his camera's screen, and when he saw the image, his mouth went dry. The figure was there in the photo, but it wasn't quite right. The proportions were off, the limbs too long, the head tilted at an angle that didn't look natural. And behind it, barely visible in the darkness, there seemed to be another passage, one that curved away in a direction that didn't match the geography of the alley he was standing in. Marcus looked up from the screen, looked at the real alley in front of him, and felt the first real stirring of fear. The passage in the photo didn't exist. The wall where it should have been was solid, unbroken concrete marked with water stains and the remnants of old advertisements. He checked the photo again, zooming in, and the passage was still there, clear as day, bending away into impossible geometry. Marcus made the decision to leave. He turned around, retracing his steps, but after 3 turns, he realized he was in an alley he didn't recognize. The walls looked the same, the narrow width was familiar, but there were no landmarks he remembered passing. He turned again, and with each turn, the feeling of being lost grew stronger. He pulled out his phone, hoping to use GPS, but there was no signal. The screen showed full bars, but when he tried to open maps, the app crashed. He tried again, with the same result, and a cold sweat began to form on his forehead. The light was almost gone now, the alleys reduced to deep blue shadows that made it hard to see more than 10 feet ahead. Marcus started walking faster, choosing turns at random, hoping to stumble back into a main road. But every passage looked the same, every turn leading to another identical alley. After 20 minutes, he was breathing hard, his professional calm completely shattered. He started calling out, first in English, then in broken Mandarin, shouting for help for anyone who could hear him. His voice echoed strangely in the narrow spaces, bouncing back at him from directions that didn't make sense, overlapping until it sounded like multiple people calling out in distress. That's when he heard the response. It came from ahead of him, from an alley he hadn't explored yet, and it was his own voice calling for help in English. The words were exactly what he had just shouted, the desperation identical, but the voice was coming from a different location. Marcus froze, his camera hanging forgotten around his neck. He heard it again, his own words, his own inflection, coming from the walls themselves. It wasn't an echo. Echoes fade and distort. This was perfect reproduction, as if someone had recorded him and was playing it back through hidden speakers. He turned slowly, looking for the source, and that's when he saw that the alley had changed. The passage behind him, the one he had just walked through, was no longer there. The wall was solid, unbroken, as if it had always been that way. Marcus pressed his hands against the concrete, feeling for seams, for hidden doors, but there was nothing. The wall was real and immovable. He spun around, looking at his only option, the alley ahead where his own voice continued to call for help, and he started running. The alley seemed to close in around him as he ran, the walls pressing closer, the darkness becoming absolute. His camera banged against his chest with each step, and he could hear his own labored breathing mixing with the impossible echoes of his voice that came from everywhere and nowhere. He turned a corner and slammed into a wall that shouldn't have been there, the impact sending him sprawling onto the damp ground. His camera struck the concrete with a sickening crack, and he heard the lens shatter. Pain bloomed in his shoulder and knee, but he scrambled to his feet, grabbing the damaged camera more out of instinct than anything else. The alley he was in now was barely 3 feet wide, so narrow he had to turn sideways to move through it. The walls on either side were rough brick, and they seemed to pulse slightly, as if they were breathing. Marcus squeezed through, his jacket catching on the rough surface, and emerged into a slightly wider space that was completely enclosed. There were no exits. 4 walls surrounded him, each one solid and ancient, covered in layers of grime and mold. In the center of the space, sitting on the ground, was a small shrine, but the offerings were wrong. Instead of fruit and incense, there were photographs, dozens of them, scattered around the base. Marcus approached slowly, his legs weak with exhaustion and terror, and picked up one of the photos. It was a picture of him, taken from behind, walking into the alleys earlier that evening. He hadn't posed for this photo. No one had been behind him. He picked up another, and it showed him from a different angle, standing in an alley and looking at his camera screen. Then another, showing him running, his face contorted with fear. The photos were all of him, all taken tonight, from impossible angles and distances. His hands trembled as he set them down, and that's when he noticed his own camera lying on the ground, the one he was still holding. There were 2 of them now, identical except that the one on the ground was older, covered in dust and cobwebs, as if it had been there for years. Marcus looked at the camera in his hands, at the shattered lens and cracked body, and felt his sanity beginning to fray. He dropped it, and it fell next to its twin, the sound echoing in the enclosed space. The walls began to make a noise then, a low grinding sound like stone moving against stone, and Marcus realized with horror that they were moving, slowly but perceptibly, closing in. He threw himself at the nearest wall, pounding on it with his fists, screaming for help in English, in broken Mandarin, in wordless animal terror. His voice echoed back at him from all directions, a chorus of his own fear, and the walls kept moving. The police found his camera 3 days later, or what was left of it. A local resident had heard strange noises coming from one of the dead-end alleys near her home, sounds like someone calling for help in a foreign language, and had called the authorities. When they arrived and searched the area, they found Marcus's camera smashed beyond repair, lying in a narrow passage that, according to their maps and local knowledge, shouldn't have existed. The alley appeared to be a dead end, a space between 2 buildings that was barely wide enough for a person to stand in, and the camera was at the far end, as if it had been thrown there with considerable force. But there was no way in or out except from the entrance, and no one had seen Marcus leave. The memory card was intact, and when they reviewed the photos, they found hundreds of images from his 3 days in Tainan. The last 10 photos were the ones that made the investigating officers uncomfortable. They showed alleys that didn't match any streets in the old district, passages that curved and bent in ways that violated basic geometry, and in several of them, barely visible in the shadows, there were figures that looked almost human but not quite, with proportions that were subtly wrong. The very last photo was the most disturbing. It showed a narrow alley bending away into darkness, and in the center of the frame, barely visible, was text written on the wall in English, in what looked like it had been scratched with fingernails. It said, "Help me, I'm still here." The handwriting matched samples of Marcus's signature from his passport. The search for Marcus Chen continued for 2 weeks, with teams of police and volunteers combing through every alley, every building, every possible space in the old district where a person could be trapped or hiding. They found nothing. No body, no evidence of violence, no indication of where he had gone. His passport and belongings were still at the guest house. His return flight to Seattle departed without him, and his family in the United States received no ransom demand, no explanation, nothing. The case was eventually classified as a missing person, likely a victim of misadventure in an unfamiliar city, but the locals knew better. They had heard stories like this before, whispered tales of the old district and what it did to outsiders who wandered too deep, who ignored the unspoken rules about where foreigners should and shouldn't go after dark. The guest house owner who had tried to warn Marcus told police that the old alleys were hungry, that they had always been hungry and that they took people sometimes, especially those who tried to capture them, to document them, to expose their secrets to the world. The police dismissed this as superstition, but they stopped searching after 2 weeks, and they quietly advised other foreigners to stay out of the old district at night. In the months that followed, several residents reported hearing a man calling for help in English, the voice coming from walls that had no doors or windows, from alleys that dead-ended into solid concrete. The sounds would last for a few minutes, desperate and pleading, then fade away as if the speaker had moved deeper into the walls themselves. No one ever found the source. And sometimes, late at night when the streets were empty, people walking past certain alleys would feel their phones vibrate, and when they checked, they would find a photo message from an unknown number, showing an image of themselves from behind, walking into the old district with a timestamp from years in the future. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. But as disturbing as that disappearance was, it's far from the only time a foreigner has encountered something inexplicable in Asia. Sometimes the horror isn't about being trapped in a place, but about being transported by something that shouldn't exist at all. In another part of Southeast Asia, in the bustling port city of Cebu in the Philippines, another American found himself in a situation that defied every rational explanation, a ride that ended in a way that security cameras would capture, but no one could truly understand. David Torres had been traveling through the Philippines for 3 weeks, island hopping and documenting his journey on social media like thousands of other backpackers do every year. He was 28, from California, and he had the easy confidence of someone who had traveled extensively and believed they understood how the world worked. Cebu City was his last stop before flying home, and he had spent the day exploring the historic sites, eating local food, and shopping for souvenirs. By the time evening arrived, David was tired but satisfied, ready to head back to his hotel near the Port District and pack for his morning flight. The sun had set completely, and the city was alive with lights and movement, jeepneys and tricycles weaving through traffic, street vendors calling out, the organized chaos that characterized Filipino cities after dark. David stood on a busy street corner trying to wave down a taxi, but several passed him by, already occupied or perhaps unwilling to deal with a foreigner who might not know where he was going. After 20 minutes, he was beginning to consider walking back, even though his hotel was a good 40-minute trek, when a taxi finally pulled up to the curb. The vehicle was an older model Toyota, painted in the standard white with a yellow roof that marked it as a legitimate taxi, and the meter sign on top was illuminated, indicating it was available. David didn't think twice. He opened the back door and slid into the seat, grateful to be off his feet. The interior of the taxi was clean but worn, the vinyl seats cracked with age, and there was a faint smell of cigarettes and air freshener. The driver was sitting perfectly still, facing forward, a silhouette against the city lights beyond the windshield. David gave the name of his hotel, speaking clearly and adding the street name for good measure, and waited for a response. The driver said nothing, didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge him in any way. For a moment, David thought maybe the man hadn't heard him, so he repeated the address, louder this time, but again there was no response. The taxi simply started moving, pulling smoothly into traffic, and David decided maybe the driver was just the quiet type, or maybe didn't speak English. That was fine. As long as they got him to the hotel, conversation wasn't necessary. He pulled out his phone to check his messages, but immediately noticed something strange. There was no signal, no bars, no indication that his phone was connecting to any network. That was odd. He had been using data all day without any issues, and Cebu City had excellent coverage. He powered the phone off and back on, but the result was the same. David looked up from his phone and felt the first stirring of unease. The city outside the windows didn't look quite right. The lights were there, the buildings, the traffic, but everything seemed slightly off, as if he were looking at it through old film or a layer of water. The colors were muted, the movements of other vehicles seemed jerky and strange, and there was no sound. He couldn't hear traffic, couldn't hear the city noise that should have been omnipresent. The taxi itself was completely silent. No engine noise, no sound of tires on pavement, nothing. David leaned forward, trying to get a better look at the driver, but the man's features were impossible to make out. He seemed to be wearing a dark shirt, his hands on the steering wheel, but his face was a blur, as if it was constantly moving or obscured by shadow. David's heart began to beat faster. He told himself he was being ridiculous, that he was tired and his imagination was running wild, but the feeling of wrongness was growing stronger with every passing second. He looked at the meter and saw that it wasn't running, the numbers frozen at 0, and that's when he realized he should tell the driver to stop, that he wanted to get out. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. His voice was gone, as if the air itself was refusing to carry it. Panic began to set in. David tried the door handle, pulling hard, but it wouldn't budge. He tried the window controls, but nothing happened. He was trapped in a moving vehicle with a driver who wouldn't speak, in a city that looked increasingly unreal. The taxi turned off the main road, and David recognized the area as being close to his hotel, but the route was wrong. They were going down streets he hadn't seen before, narrow roads lined with buildings that looked abandoned, windows dark and empty. The streetlights here were different too, older-style lamps that cast a yellow glow that seemed to barely penetrate the darkness. David pounded on the window with his fist, trying to attract attention from anyone who might be outside, but the streets were empty. There were no pedestrians, no other vehicles, no signs of life at all. The taxi kept moving at a steady pace, turning corners, passing through intersections where the traffic lights cycled through their colors, but there was no cross-traffic to stop for. Time seemed to stretch and compress. David had no idea how long they had been driving. It could have been 10 minutes or an hour, his sense of duration completely scrambled by the surreal quality of the journey. He tried his phone again, desperate for any connection to the normal world, but the screen was dim now. The being battery draining impossibly fast, even though it had been nearly full when he got in the taxi. He watched in horror as the percentage dropped from 80% to 40 to 20 to 5, all in the span of what felt like seconds. The phone died completely, the screen going black, and David was left with nothing but his own reflection in the window, his face pale and frightened, overlaid on the strange cityscape sliding past outside. The hotel finally came into view, the familiar facade appearing at the end of a street that David was certain he had never been on before. The taxi pulled up to the curb directly in front of the entrance, coming to a stop so smoothly it felt like they had simply ceased moving rather than actively braking. The silence inside the vehicle was absolute, and David sat there for a moment, his hand on the door handle, afraid that it still wouldn't open, that he was trapped here forever in this impossible taxi. But when he pulled, the door swung open easily, and the sounds of the normal city rushed in. Car horns and voices and the distant throb of music from a bar down the street. David practically fell out of the taxi, stumbling onto the sidewalk, his legs weak and shaky. He turned back to pay the driver, reaching for his wallet, but the words of thanks died in his throat. The driver's seat was empty. The entire front of the taxi was empty. No one behind the wheel, no one in the passenger seat. The interior lights were off, but there was enough illumination from the street to see clearly that he was looking at an unoccupied vehicle. David's hands began to shake. He looked up and down the street, thinking the driver must have gotten out, must be standing nearby. But there was no one. And when he looked back at the taxi, his blood turned to ice. It was gone. The curb where it had been parked seconds ago was empty, just bare pavement and the faint glow of streetlights. There was no sound of an engine starting, no screech of tires, no indication that a vehicle had just driven away. It had simply ceased to exist. David stood there, alone on the sidewalk, his mind refusing to process what had just happened. A hotel security guard approached, asking in English if he was okay, if he needed assistance, and David tried to explain, his words tumbling over each other, barely coherent. He pointed to where the taxi had been, tried to describe the ride, the silent driver, the strange city outside the windows. But even as he spoke, he could hear how insane it sounded. The security guard listened patiently, his expression a mix of concern and skepticism, and then gently suggested that David should come inside, maybe have some water, sit down for a moment. David let himself be led into the hotel lobby, his legs moving automatically, his mind still trying to make sense of the impossible. The lobby was bright and normal, tourists checking in, staff moving efficiently behind the desk, everything exactly as it should be. David sank into a chair, and the security guard brought him water, speaking quietly into his radio, calling for the shift supervisor. When the supervisor arrived, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and an air of authority, she asked David what had happened, and he told the story again, more slowly this time, trying to include every detail. As he spoke, he became aware of something cold and heavy in his jacket pocket, something that hadn't been there before. He reached in and pulled out a handful of coins, old Philippine pesos that looked like they hadn't been in circulation for decades, tarnished and worn. He had never seen these coins before, had never put them in his pocket, but here they were, tangible proof that something had happened during that ride. The supervisor took the coins, examining them with a frown, and then excused herself, returning a few minutes later with another staff member, an older man who looked at the coins and then at David with an expression that was hard to read. The man spoke quietly with the supervisor in Tagalog, too fast for David to follow, even if he had understood the language, and then the supervisor turned back to David and asked him a strange question. She wanted to know if he had asked the taxi to take him to the hotel, or if the driver had just known where to go. David thought back and realized he had said the name of the hotel, but the driver had never acknowledged it, had never responded at all. The driver had known where to go without being told, or the taxi had known, and the distinction suddenly seemed very important. The supervisor nodded slowly, as if David had confirmed something she already suspected, and then she made a decision. She told David that they were going to review the security footage from outside the hotel, the cameras that monitored the entrance and the street. She said it was important, that they needed to verify what had happened, and David agreed immediately, grateful for any chance to prove he wasn't losing his mind. They went to the security office, a small room filled with monitors and recording equipment, and the technician on duty pulled up the footage from the past hour. David stood behind the technician's chair, watching the screen as the timestamp scrolled backward, showing the entrance to the hotel in reverse. Guests coming and going, vehicles pulling up and driving away. Then the technician stopped, reversed a bit more, and played it forward at normal speed. David watched himself stumble out of nothing onto the sidewalk. There was no taxi. The footage showed him appearing from thin air, his body language showing the motion of stepping out of a vehicle, his hand reaching back as if to close a door, but there was nothing there. He stood on empty pavement, alone, and then he turned around, and the camera captured his face perfectly, the expression of absolute horror as he looked at something the camera couldn't see. The footage continued, showing him pointing at empty space, then standing there in shock until the security guard approached. David watched the whole sequence 3 times, and with each viewing, the reality of what had happened became more undeniable and more impossible to accept. He had been in that taxi. He had felt the seat beneath him, heard the silence, seen the strange city outside the windows. But according to every piece of objective evidence, he had simply appeared on the street, arriving at the hotel by means that couldn't be explained or documented. The supervisor sent the security guard to check with the taxi stand down the street, to see if any drivers had dropped off a foreign passenger at the hotel in the past hour, but the answer came back negative. No one had seen David arrive, no taxi had been dispatched to his pickup location, and when they called the taxi companies, none of them had any record of a fare matching his description or destination. It was as if the journey had never happened, except David knew it had. His memories of those 20 or 30 or 40 minutes were vivid and detailed, more real in some ways than the brightly lit hotel lobby where he now sat. The old coins were still there, sitting on the desk in the security office, and when the older staff member explained their significance, David felt a chill run down his spine. The coins were from the 1960s and 70s, decades out of circulation, the kind of thing collectors might have but ordinary people wouldn't carry. And according to local folklore, which the staff member related with obvious reluctance, there were stories of ghost taxis in Cebu, vehicles that appeared late at night and transported passengers through a version of the city that existed alongside the real one, a shadow city where time moved differently, and the dead sometimes drove the living to places they didn't know they needed to go. The stories were old, passed down through generations, and most people dismissed them as superstition. But every few years, someone would report an experience like David's, a silent ride in a taxi that didn't exist, a journey that ended with the passenger appearing out of nowhere, shaken and confused, unable to explain what had happened. David didn't sleep that night. He sat in his hotel room with all the lights on, his packed bags by the door, waiting for morning and his flight home. The coins sat on the nightstand, and he couldn't stop looking at them. These impossible objects that proved something had happened, even if no one else could see it. When dawn finally came and the city began to wake up, he felt a measure of relief, as if the sunlight could burn away the memory of that ride. He checked out early, took a normal taxi to the airport, one with a talkative driver and a working meter and the mundane reality of traffic jams and radio chatter. But even as his plane took off, climbing into the clear blue sky above Cebu, David couldn't shake the feeling that he had been marked somehow, that the ghost taxi had chosen him for a reason he didn't understand, and that somewhere in the shadow version of the city, a silent driver was still waiting, still circling the streets, looking for the next passenger who would step into a vehicle that shouldn't exist. The footage from the hotel security camera was eventually archived, buried in the system among thousands of hours of ordinary recordings. But the staff who saw it never forgot. And sometimes, late at night when the city grew quiet, they would see taxis pulling up to the hotel entrance, their meters dark, their drivers silent and still, and they would watch as passengers got out of vehicles that the cameras couldn't see, looking terrified and confused, paying invisible fares to drivers who were no longer alive. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. And while these stories already chill the blood, what comes next reveals something even more disturbing about how certain places in Asia hold on to their dead, and how the living sometimes stumble into realms they were never meant to see. The encounters you've heard so far are only the beginning, because in the next part, we'll explore stories where reality itself seems to bend around ancient beliefs, where hotels hide secrets in their walls and villages guard traditions that outsiders pay dearly for violating. If you want to, there's a link to buy me a coffee in the description. Only if you want to. Of course, I already appreciate you listening to my videos. For now, prepare yourself, because what follows takes us deeper into the shadows that Asia casts across the modern world. Ryan Mitchell had been in South Korea for exactly 5 weeks when he first heard the tapping. He was 21 years old, a junior studying international business at a university in Daegu, and he had chosen the exchange program partly because it looked good on his resume, and partly because he wanted to experience something radically different from his life in Boston. The dormitory they assigned him was an older building on the edge of campus, 7 stories tall with narrow hallways and small rooms that smelled faintly of cleaning products and kimchi. His room was on the 6th floor, and for the first month, everything had been fine, exciting even. The challenge of navigating a new language and culture, keeping him energized despite the long hours of classes, and the isolation that came from being thousands of miles from everyone he knew. But on a Thursday night in late November, as he was lying in bed trying to sleep, he heard a sound that made his eyes snap open in the darkness. It was tapping, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from directly above his head. Tap, 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 pause, tap, 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 pause, the pattern repeating over and over with mechanical precision. Ryan stared at the ceiling, listening, and felt an inexplicable sense of unease settle over him like a cold blanket. The tapping continued for perhaps 10 minutes, then stopped as abruptly as it had begun, leaving Ryan lying in silence, his heart beating faster than it should have been. He told himself it was just another student on the floor above, working late on something, maybe hanging pictures or doing repairs. But the hour was past midnight, and the sound had an urgency to it that didn't match those mundane explanations. He eventually fell into an uneasy sleep, and when he woke the next morning, the incident felt distant and less threatening in the daylight. He went to class, studied in the library, had dinner with a few other exchange students, and didn't think about the tapping again until that night when it started once more, at almost exactly the same time, the same rhythm, the same location directly above his bed. This time Ryan got up, went into the hallway, and climbed the stairs to the 7th floor. He knew his room was near the end of the corridor, so the room above his should be in the same position. But when he reached the 7th floor and walked to where that room should be, he found only a wall. The corridor ended several rooms earlier than it did on his floor, and there was no room directly above his. That made no sense. Buildings didn't work that way. Floors were supposed to align. Ryan stood there in his pajamas, barefoot on the cold linoleum, staring at the wall and feeling the first stirrings of something he couldn't quite name. He went back downstairs, checked his floor to make sure he had the right location, then went up again. The result was the same. There was no room above his, just empty space that according to the building's layout shouldn't exist. The next day, Ryan asked his Korean roommate about the 7th floor, trying to phrase the question casually, not wanting to sound crazy. His roommate, a quiet engineering student named Jiho, gave him a strange look and said there was nothing special about the 7th floor. It was just dorm rooms like every other floor. Ryan pressed, asking if there were any rooms that were closed off or unused, and Jiho's expression shifted, becoming guarded. He said that Ryan should stop asking questions about the building's layout, that some things were better left alone, especially for foreigners who didn't understand the history. Ryan wanted to push further, but Jiho's discomfort was obvious, and he let the matter drop. That night, the tapping started again, but this time it was louder, more insistent, and it lasted for over an hour. Ryan lay in bed with his pillow over his head, trying to block out the sound, but it seemed to penetrate everything, filling his skull with its relentless rhythm. When it finally stopped, he made a decision. He was going to find out what was making that noise, even if it meant breaking some unspoken rule about privacy or trespassing. The next afternoon, when most students were in class, Ryan went back to the 7th floor with a clear mission. He walked the entire length of the corridor, counting doors, measuring distances with his paced steps, and confirmed what he already suspected. The 7th floor was shorter than the 6th by approximately the length of 2 rooms. That space had to exist somewhere, and if it wasn't accessible from the inside corridor, then maybe it was reachable from outside. Ryan went back to his room and looked out his window, craning his neck to see the floor above. The building's exterior showed windows evenly spaced on every floor, including what should be the rooms above his. But when he looked at the 7th floor windows that would correspond to his location, they were different. They were smaller, older style windows with bars across them, and they looked like they hadn't been cleaned in years, the glass dark and opaque with grime. More importantly, they were set back slightly from the rest of the floor's windows, as if that section of the building had been modified at some point, closed off from the interior. Ryan felt a chill despite the warmth of his heated room. There was a space up there, a hidden space that students weren't supposed to know about, and something in that space was making the tapping noise every night. He spent the rest of the day planning, and by evening he had decided on a course of action that he knew was risky but felt necessary. He was going to access the roof and see if there was a way to reach that hidden section from above. The dormitory had roof access, a door on the 8th floor that led to a small area where students sometimes went to smoke or get fresh air, though it was technically against the rules to be up there after dark. Ryan waited until well past midnight, when the building was quiet and most students were asleep, then climbed the stairs to the 8th floor with a flashlight and a growing sense that he was making a mistake. The roof access door was unlocked, just a simple handle that turned easily under his hand, and he stepped out into the cold November air, the wind immediately cutting through his jacket and making him shiver. The roof was flat concrete with low walls around the perimeter, various ventilation equipment and satellite dishes creating dark shapes against the city lights beyond. Ryan walked carefully, sweeping his flashlight beam across the surface, looking for any sign of an access point to the space below. It took him nearly 20 minutes of searching before he found it, tucked behind a large air conditioning unit in the corner of the roof that corresponded to the hidden section. It was a wooden structure, low and square, like a small shed built directly into the roof. The wood was old and weathered, dark with age and moisture, and there was a door in the front held shut by a heavy chain and padlock. The chain looked new, thick steel links that gleamed slightly in the beam of Ryan's flashlight, completely at odds with the ancient wood it was securing. Ryan approached slowly, his breath visible in the cold air, and as he got closer, he saw that there were characters carved into the wood around the doorframe, Korean script that he couldn't read, but that looked deliberate and formal, like a warning or a seal. He knelt in front of the door, shining his light through the gap where the two halves met, trying to see what was inside. The tapping started immediately, so loud and sudden that Ryan jerked backward, nearly dropping his flashlight. It was coming from inside the wooden structure, directly on the other side of the door, and it was accompanied by something else, a sound like fingers scraping against wood, slow and deliberate. Ryan's hands began to shake, and every instinct in his body screamed at him to leave, to go back downstairs and forget he had ever come up here. But he was frozen, unable to look away from that gap in the door. The scraping continued, and then he saw movement in the darkness beyond, something pale shifting into view. It was a hand, thin and white, the fingers unnaturally long, and it was sliding through the gap between the door and frame, a space that should have been too narrow for anything to fit through. But the hand kept coming, pushing through, and as Ryan watched in horrified fascination, the fingers began to move, mimicking the position of his own hand where it rested on his knee. When he lifted his hand, the pale fingers lifted. When he made a fist, they curled into the same shape. It was copying him, matching his movements with perfect synchronization, and the realization sent a bolt of pure terror through Ryan's chest. He scrambled to his feet, backing away from the wooden structure, and the hand withdrew as quickly as it had appeared, sliding back through the impossible gap and disappearing into the darkness. The tapping resumed, louder now, angry, and Ryan turned and ran for the roof access door, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He made it back to his room and locked the door, pushing his desk chair against it for added security, even though he knew that was irrational, that whatever was in that rooftop structure couldn't follow him down here. But the fear was beyond rational thought now. It was primal and overwhelming, and Ryan spent the rest of the night sitting on his bed with all his lights on, listening for any sound from above. The tapping didn't return that night, and as dawn broke and the dormitory began to wake around him, Ryan started to think that maybe it was over, that his encounter on the roof had somehow ended it. He was wrong. The tapping started again the next night, but this time it wasn't coming from above his room. It was coming from inside his room, from the walls, from the ceiling directly over his head no matter where he stood. Ryan moved to the corner and the tapping followed, repositioning itself. He went into the bathroom and it came from the wall tiles. He even went out into the hallway and he could hear it following him, always just above or behind, that relentless rhythm that he now recognized as a kind of pursuit. Other students began to notice. His roommate Jiho heard it too, though he refused to talk about it, moving his bedding into a friend's room down the hall and leaving Ryan alone. The resident advisor came to investigate after noise complaints from neighboring rooms, but when he entered, the tapping stopped, only to resume the moment he left. Ryan tried to explain about the rooftop, about the wooden structure in the hand, but the RA just looked at him with pity and suggested he might be stressed, that he should visit the campus counseling center. The tapping wasn't confined to the dormitory anymore. By the end of the week, Ryan started hearing it in other places, always positioned near him, always just out of direct sight, but close enough that he knew it was there. He heard it on the bus to campus, a rapid tapping on the window beside his head, even though the bus was moving at 40 kilometers per hour and there was nothing outside but passing traffic. He heard it in the library, coming from the bookshelf behind him, the sound causing other students to look around in annoyance. He heard it in the cafeteria, in lecture halls, in the bathroom of his favorite coffee shop. It was following him everywhere, and no one else seemed to hear it with the same intensity. They noticed a noise, complained about the disruption, but for Ryan it was overwhelming, constant, a presence that never left him alone. He stopped sleeping, afraid of what would happen if he let his guard down, and his grades began to slip. His appearance deteriorated, dark circles under his eyes, his hands shaking from exhaustion and fear. The other exchange students started avoiding him, put off by his erratic behavior and the strange noises that seemed to follow him around. By the second week, Ryan was desperate enough to seek help from someone who might actually understand. He found a small shop near campus that sold traditional items, talismans, and incense and books on Korean folklore, and the elderly woman who ran it listened to his story with an expression that grew increasingly grave. She told him that he had violated a boundary that should never have been crossed, that the rooftop structure was a place where certain spirits had been sealed, spirits of people who had died in the building decades ago under circumstances that were never made public. The wooden structure was maintained by local shamans, the chains replaced regularly, the seals refreshed, all to keep what was inside from affecting the living students who now occupied the building. But by approaching it, by looking through the gap, Ryan had made himself visible to what was inside. And worse, by letting it mimic his movements, he had created a connection that wouldn't easily be broken. The spirits were claiming him, marking him as someone who belonged to their space. And the tapping was their way of asserting that claim, of pulling him closer to the boundary between the living world and wherever they existed. The woman said there were rituals that could help, ceremonies that could sever the connection, but they required time and money and the cooperation of people Ryan didn't know and couldn't easily contact. More immediately, she told him that he needed to stop acknowledging the tapping, stop reacting to it, because every time he did, he was reinforcing the connection. She gave him a small cloth pouch filled with herbs and written prayers, told him to keep it with him always, and warned him that if the situation escalated beyond the tapping, if he started seeing the hand or other manifestations in places outside the rooftop, he needed to leave Korea immediately. The spirits had rules, she explained, boundaries they couldn't cross, and one of those boundaries was geographic. If he left the country, returned to America, the connection would weaken over time, though it might never completely disappear. Ryan took her advice seriously, clutching the pouch she had given him and trying desperately to ignore the tapping that continued to follow him through every moment of every day. But ignoring it was nearly impossible. The sound had worked its way into his consciousness so deeply that he heard it even in moments of complete silence, his brain filling in the rhythm even when it wasn't actually present. He lasted another week before he made the decision to leave. He contacted his university back in Boston, explained that he was having health issues, and arranged to withdraw from the exchange program early. His parents were confused and concerned when he called them. Barely coherent and clearly not well, but they agreed to help him get home. The process of leaving took 3 days. 3 days of packing his belongings while the tapping continued. 3 days of avoiding Jiho and the other students who looked at him like he had lost his mind. 3 days of barely eating or sleeping because the fear had consumed everything else. On his last night in the dormitory, Ryan lay in his bed staring at the ceiling, and the tapping was so loud it felt like it was inside his skull. But beneath the tapping, he heard something else, a voice speaking Korean. The words unclear, but the tone unmistakable. It was calling him, inviting him back to the roof, telling him that if he came up just one more time, if he opened the door, everything would stop. Ryan pressed the herb pouch against his chest and prayed to a God he had never been particularly close to, begging for the night to pass, for morning to come so he could get to the airport and escape. Morning did come, and Ryan left the dormitory without saying goodbye to anyone, his luggage packed haphazardly, his hands shaking as he got into the taxi that would take him to Incheon Airport. The tapping followed him to the elevator, stopped when he reached the ground floor, and resumed faintly as the taxi pulled away from the building. But as they drove through Daegu toward the highway, the sound began to fade, growing more distant with each kilometer, until by the time they reached the outskirts of the city, it was barely audible. Ryan felt something break inside him, relief mixed with exhaustion, and he slumped in the back seat and cried quietly while the driver pretended not to notice. The flight home was long and uncomfortable, but blessedly quiet. Ryan didn't hear the tapping once during the 14 hours it took to get from Seoul to Seattle to Boston, and when he finally walked into his parents' house in the suburbs, the silence was so complete it felt alien. His parents took one look at him and insisted he see a doctor who found nothing physically wrong, but recommended therapy for what he diagnosed as severe anxiety and possible psychotic break brought on by the stress of studying abroad. Ryan didn't argue, didn't try to explain about the rooftop or the hand or the spirits that had claimed him. He took the medication they prescribed and went to the sessions and slowly, over the course of months, began to resemble something like his old self. But the tapping never completely left. Even now, years later, Ryan sometimes hears it in moments of quiet, a faint rhythm that comes from no identifiable source, a reminder of the boundary he crossed and the connection he made in the dormitory in Daegu. He never went back to Korea, never finished his degree in international business, and he never told anyone the full truth of what happened to him during those final weeks in the dormitory. The herb pouch the shopwoman gave him sits in a box in his closet, dried and faded now, but he keeps it because throwing it away feels dangerous, like it might break whatever small protection it still offers. And sometimes, late at night when he's lying in bed trying to sleep, he feels the urge to go up to the highest point of whatever building he's in, to find the roof and look for a wooden structure that he knows won't be there but might appear anyway. Because once you've been claimed by something, once you've made yourself visible to spirits that exist in sealed spaces, the claim never fully releases its hold. The university in Daegu still stands, the dormitory still houses students, and the wooden structure on the roof remains chained and sealed, maintained by shamans who understand that some boundaries exist for good reason, and that foreigners who don't know the rules sometimes pay a price for their ignorance that follows them across oceans and through years. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. But spirits confined to rooftops and sealed spaces are one kind of horror. The horror of crossing boundaries you didn't know existed. There's another kind, though, one that involves entities that wait in liminal spaces, that present themselves as vulnerable and innocent, and that attach themselves to people who offer help without understanding what they're truly agreeing to. In the coastal regions of Southeast Asia, where the ocean meets the land and fog rolls in before dawn, these encounters happen more often than anyone wants to admit. James and Catherine Porter were on their honeymoon when they encountered the girl at the pier. They were both 29 from Portland, and they had chosen Malaysia for their trip because it offered a mix of beaches, culture, and adventure that neither of them had experienced before. Kota Kinabalu in Sabah had been recommended by Catherine's coworker, who had spent a summer there years ago and spoke highly of the diving and the seafood and the laid-back atmosphere. The Porters had been in the city for 4 days, staying at a mid-range hotel near the waterfront, and they had fallen into a pleasant routine of sleeping late, eating at local restaurants, and exploring the markets and nearby islands during the day. On their 5th morning, Catherine woke up unusually early, just before dawn, and found herself unable to fall back asleep. She got up quietly, not wanting to wake James, and decided to take a walk along the waterfront to watch the sunrise. She left a note on her pillow, grabbed a light jacket, and slipped out of their 4th-floor room into the empty hotel corridor. The city was still mostly asleep at this hour, the streets quiet except for the occasional passing vehicle and the distant sound of fishing boats preparing to head out. Catherine walked toward the main pier, a long wooden structure that extended out into the South China Sea, used during the day by tour operators and fishermen, but empty now in the pre-dawn darkness. The fog was thick, rolling in off the water in gray waves that reduced visibility to perhaps 20 feet, and the air was cool and damp against her skin. She loved this kind of weather, the way it made familiar places feel mysterious and new, and she walked slowly, breathing deeply, feeling grateful for the life she had built with James. As she approached the pier, she heard a sound that made her stop and listen. It was crying, soft and intermittent, the sound of a child in distress. Catherine's first instinct was maternal, even though she and James didn't have children yet, and she walked faster, trying to locate the source of the crying. She found the girl about halfway down the pier, sitting on the edge with her legs dangling over the water. The child looked to be perhaps 8 or 9 years old, wearing a simple dress that was soaked through, her long black hair hanging in wet strands around her face. She was crying quietly, her small shoulders shaking, and Catherine's heart immediately went out to her. She approached carefully, not wanting to startle the girl, and called out in English, asking if she was okay, if she was lost, if she needed help. The girl turned to look at Catherine, and even through the fog and the dim light, Catherine could see that her face was pale, unnaturally so, and her eyes were dark and somehow wrong, too large or too empty. But the child was clearly in distress, and Catherine pushed aside the instinctive unease and knelt down beside her, asking again if she was okay. The girl spoke in heavily accented English, her voice small and frightened, saying she couldn't find her mother, that they had been at the pier and her mother had gone into the water and hadn't come back. Catherine felt a surge of alarm. She asked when this had happened, tried to get details, but the girl's story was vague and confused, as if she was too upset to remember clearly. Catherine pulled out her phone to call for help, but there was no signal, which was strange because she had full coverage at the hotel just a few blocks away. She told the girl not to worry, that they would find her mother, that everything would be okay, and she asked where the girl had last seen her mother. The child pointed toward the dark water beyond the end of the pier, her arm extending with an odd stiffness, and she said her mother was down there, that she had gone down and was waiting. Catherine looked at the water, black and opaque in the fog, and felt the first real stirring of something being very wrong here. She turned back to the girl, intending to suggest they go back to shore and find the police, but as she was opening her mouth to speak, she heard footsteps behind her. James was jogging down the pier, calling her name, holding the note she had left. He reached them, slightly out of breath, and asked what was going on. Catherine explained quickly, gesturing to the girl, and James knelt down as well, his expression shifting from confusion to concern. He tried speaking to the girl in English, then attempted a few words of Malay he had learned from a guidebook. But the child just stared at them with those 2 large eyes and repeated that her mother was in the water, that they needed to help find her mother. James stood up and walked to the edge of the pier, looking down into the dark water, and Catherine stayed with the girl, putting an arm around her shoulders and feeling how cold she was. How her wet dress seemed to be getting wetter even though she wasn't moving. James came back, shaking his head, saying he couldn't see anything, that they needed to get help from someone who knew the area. He suggested they take the girl back to their hotel, get her warm and dry, and call the proper authorities. Catherine agreed, and she stood up, holding out her hand to the girl, telling her to come with them, that they would help her find her mother. The girl took Catherine's hand, and the touch was like plunging her fingers into ice water, so cold it burned. Catherine gasped and pulled back instinctively, and in that moment of broken contact, she looked away, glanced at James to see if he had noticed. It was only a second, perhaps 2, but when she looked back, the girl was gone. The pier was empty, just wet wood and fog, and the sound of water lapping against the support posts below. Catherine and James stared at each other, then at the place where the girl had been sitting, and James said what Catherine was thinking but didn't want to voice. There was no one there. There had been no one there. But they had both seen her, both spoken to her. Catherine had touched her shoulder and felt the cold wetness of her dress. They searched the pier, walking its entire length, looking behind equipment lockers and under the few benches, calling out, but there was no sign of the child. No footprints in the condensation on the wood, no trace of where she had gone. The fog was beginning to lift slightly as the sun started to rise, and in the growing light, the pier looked completely normal, just a utilitarian structure built for boats and tourists. Nothing sinister or strange about it. Catherine felt sick, a churning in her stomach that had nothing to do with hunger, and everything to do with the wrongness of what had just happened. They returned to the hotel in silence, both of them processing what they had experienced, trying to find a rational explanation and failing. Back in their room, Catherine showered, scrubbing her hand where she had touched the girl, trying to get rid of the lingering sensation of cold that seemed to have penetrated to the bone. James searched online for reports of missing children in Kota Kinabalu, for drownings or accidents at the pier, but found nothing recent. They tried to carry on with their day, went to a scheduled island tour, but the joy had gone out of the trip. They were both distracted, jumping at sounds, looking over their shoulders. When they returned to the hotel in the late afternoon, exhausted and emotionally drained, they agreed to just order room service and stay in for the evening. They ate in near silence, watching a movie on the television without really following the plot, and as night fell, they got into bed early, hoping that sleep would reset things, that morning would bring clarity and distance from the strange encounter. Catherine fell asleep first, worn out by stress and confusion, but she was pulled from sleep hours later by a sound that made her heart race even before she was fully conscious. It was splashing, rhythmic and loud, coming from outside their window. They were on the 4th floor, 4 stories above street level, and there was nothing outside their window but air and the alley behind the hotel. But the splashing was unmistakable, the sound of hands or feet moving through water, energetic and persistent. Catherine sat up slowly, afraid to look but unable to stop herself, and she turned toward the window. The curtains were thin, and the street light from below cast enough illumination that she could see the glass clearly. There was water on it, on the outside, running down in streams as if someone had just thrown a bucket of liquid against the window. But the water wasn't falling, it was moving upward, defying gravity. And in the reflection on the glass, Catherine saw a figure standing just behind where she and James lay in bed. It was the girl from the pier, her dress still soaking wet, her hair plastered to her skull, and her face was pressed close to the back of Catherine's head, close enough that Catherine could feel cold breath on her neck. The girl's reflection was smiling, but it wasn't a happy smile. It was too wide, too knowing, and her lips were moving, forming words that Catherine couldn't hear but could somehow understand. "You found me," the girl's reflection was saying. "You found me." And the gratitude in those words was terrible, wrong, because Catherine understood with a sudden, horrible clarity that she and James hadn't encountered a lost child. They had encountered something that had been waiting, something that needed to be found, and by approaching it, by offering help, they had completed some kind of transaction they never agreed to. Catherine screamed, a raw sound that brought James awake instantly, and the moment he sat up, the reflection vanished. The water on the window was gone, the splashing stopped, and they were alone in a normal hotel room with nothing to indicate that anything unusual had happened. James turned on all the lights, checked the window, looked outside, but there was nothing. Catherine was shaking, unable to speak coherently, and James held her, trying to calm her down, asking what she had seen. When she finally managed to explain, haltingly and with tears streaming down her face, James made an immediate decision. They were leaving, right now, tonight, not waiting for morning or their scheduled checkout, or any of the careful plans they had made. He started packing their bags with frantic energy, and Catherine helped, both of them throwing clothes and toiletries into suitcases without any organization, just desperate to get everything together so they could get out. They were ready in less than 20 minutes, and they went down to the lobby, startling the night clerk who had been dozing at the desk. James explained that there was a family emergency, that they needed to check out immediately, and while the clerk processed the early departure and called a taxi, Catherine stood near the front doors, staring out at the dark street and feeling like she was being watched from every shadow. The taxi arrived, and they loaded their luggage and climbed in, giving the driver the name of the airport, even though there were no flights until morning. James figured they could wait at the terminal. Anywhere was better than the hotel. Anywhere was better than Kota Kinabalu. As the taxi pulled away from the hotel, Catherine looked back at their window on the 4th floor, and her blood turned to ice. The girl was standing in the window, visible despite the darkness of the room, her pale face pressed against the glass from the inside, her hand raised in a slow wave. Catherine grabbed James's arm, pointed, but by the time he looked, the window was dark and empty. The driver noticed their distress, asked if they were okay, and James lied smoothly, said they had just received bad news from home and needed to get back to the United States as soon as possible. The driver nodded sympathetically and drove faster, and neither James nor Catherine spoke for the rest of the journey to the airport. They spent the night in the terminal, sitting in a brightly lit waiting area, surrounded by other travelers, and Catherine dozed fitfully against James's shoulder while he kept watch, his eyes scanning the crowds for any sign of a small girl in a wet dress. Morning came, they boarded their flight, and as the plane climbed into the sky and Kota Kinabalu fell away beneath them, Catherine allowed herself to believe that it was over, that they had escaped. But the relief was temporary. Back in Portland, in the safety of their own home, Catherine and James tried to return to normal life, but the encounter at the pier had left marks that weren't visible to anyone else. Catherine couldn't take baths anymore, couldn't stand to be in water that rose above her waist because every time she tried, she felt small cold hands on her ankles, pulling down. James developed a fear of reflections, covering the mirrors in their house because he kept seeing movement in them out of the corner of his eye, a figure that shouldn't be there. They never talked about Malaysia with friends or family, deflecting questions about their honeymoon with vague positive comments and quick changes of subject. And sometimes, always at night, always when they were close to sleep, they would hear splashing, faint but distinct, coming from the bathroom or the kitchen, or sometimes from right beside their bed. They learned to ignore it, to pretend it wasn't happening, because acknowledging it seemed to make it worse, seemed to give it more presence in their lives. The encounters became less frequent over time, months passing between incidents, and they began to hope. The distance and time were weakening whatever connection they had made on that foggy pier, but neither of them ever fully shook the feeling that they had been marked by something, that by trying to help a child who wasn't really a child, they had made themselves visible to an entity that existed in the spaces between the living and the dead, an entity that was grateful for being found, and the gratitude was a burden they would carry for the rest of their lives. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. The last 2 stories are different from what you've heard so far. They're quieter, more subtle, but far more disturbing because they deal with violations that aren't dramatic or violent, but are instead slow and insidious, the kind of horror that comes from realizing too late that you've wandered into something ancient and unchangeable, something that operates by rules you'll never fully understand. What follows are encounters where the supernatural doesn't announce itself with obvious signs, but instead weaves itself into the fabric of normal life, until you can't tell where reality ends and the other world begins. Michael Garrett noticed the hallway was wrong the first night he arrived at the Hotel Majapahit in Bandung. He was 34, a software developer from San Francisco who had decided to spend 2 weeks traveling through Indonesia after his company went through layoffs, and he found himself with unexpected free time and a severance package large enough to fund the trip. Bandung had been recommended by a travel blogger whose site Michael followed, described as a city with colonial architecture, cool mountain air, and a vibrant art scene that felt more authentic than the tourist-heavy areas of Bali. The Hotel Majapahit was one of the city's historic properties, built in the 1920s during the Dutch colonial period, and it had the kind of faded grandeur that Michael found appealing. All high ceilings and tile floors and dark wood furniture that had been polished smooth by decades of use. He checked in late on a Tuesday evening, tired from the drive from Jakarta, and the front desk clerk gave him a key card for room 212 on the second floor. The elevator was an old cage-style affair that creaked and groaned as it carried him up, and when the doors opened, Michael stepped into a corridor that felt immediately off in a way he couldn't quite articulate. The hallway was long and narrow, lit by wall sconces that cast pools of yellow light every few meters, leaving deep shadows in between. The walls were covered in dark wallpaper with a pattern that looked like vines or branches, and the carpet was worn in the center where generations of guests had walked. Michael's room was at the far end, and as he walked toward it, pulling his suitcase behind him, he had the uncomfortable sensation that the corridor was longer than it should be, that the perspective was wrong somehow, as if the walls were converging at an angle that didn't match what his eyes were seeing. He counted the doors as he passed them, 202, 204, 206, the even numbers marching up in sequence, but the spaces between them felt irregular, some closer together than others. When he finally reached 212, he was slightly out of breath, even though the walk hadn't been that long, and he had to try the key card 3 times before the lock clicked open. The room itself was pleasant enough, spacious and clean with a large window overlooking the city, and Michael unpacked quickly before collapsing into bed, exhausted and ready for sleep. But as he was drifting off, he heard sounds from the corridor outside his room, footsteps that seemed to echo strangely, too loud and then too soft, and voices speaking in languages he couldn't identify, the words blending together into a susurrus that was almost musical. He pulled a pillow over his head, and eventually sleep claimed him, but his dreams were filled with corridors that stretched forever, doors that opened onto other doors, and the feeling of being watched by something patient and curious. Morning brought sunlight and a sense of normalcy that made the previous night's unease seem foolish. Michael showered, dressed, and left his room to explore the city, using the stairs instead of the elevator, because he wanted to get his bearings, and the stairwell seemed straightforward and simple compared to the hallway. He spent the day walking through Bandung streets, visiting museums and cafes, taking photographs of the Art Deco buildings that gave the city its distinctive character. When he returned to the hotel in the late afternoon, he entered through the main lobby and headed for the elevator, but as he reached for the call button, the desk clerk called out to him, asking if everything was satisfactory with his room. Michael assured him it was fine, and the clerk smiled, but there was something in his expression that seemed knowing, as if he was aware of something Michael wasn't. Michael shook off the feeling and rode the elevator to the second floor, but when the doors opened, he paused. The corridor looked different in the daylight that filtered through a window at the far end, and he realized with a start that the hallway seemed shorter now. The distance to his room compressed so that it was only perhaps 30 feet instead of the much longer stretch it had seemed last night. He walked to room 212, counting doors again, and found that there were fewer of them, that some of the numbers he remembered passing were simply not there anymore. 208 was followed by 212, with no 210 in between. Michael stood in front of his door, staring at the number plate, and felt the first real stirring of fear. He spent that evening in his room, ordering food from room service and trying to focus on a book he had brought, but his attention kept drifting to the door and the corridor beyond. As night fell and the building settled into quiet, Michael heard the sounds again, footsteps and voices, and occasionally what sounded like furniture being moved in rooms that, according to the hotel's layout, shouldn't exist. Around midnight, he decided he needed to see for himself what was happening out there, and he opened his door carefully, peering into the hallway. It was empty, but the perspective was wrong again. The corridor stretching away from him in both directions, farther than should be possible given the dimensions of the building. The lighting was dimmer than it had been during the day, several of the wall sconces dark or flickering, and the shadows between the pools of light seemed deeper, almost solid. Michael stepped out into the hallway, letting his door close behind him, and immediately realized his mistake. The soft click of the latch was followed by a change in the air pressure, a subtle shift that made his ears pop. And when he turned to go back into his room, the key card wouldn't work. He tried it multiple times, holding it against the reader and waiting for the light to turn green. But nothing happened. The door remained locked, and Michael felt panic beginning to build in his chest. He was locked out of his room in the middle of the night in a corridor that didn't feel right, and he needed to get back inside or at least get to the lobby and get help from the front desk. Michael walked back toward the elevator, but the hallway seemed to be actively resisting him. The distance stretched with each step, the pools of light spaced further apart, and doors that he was certain had been on his left were now on his right. He passed room 208, then 206, but between them were numbers that shouldn't exist. 207.5, 205B, numbers written in different fonts and styles, as if they had been added at different times by different people. Michael started walking faster, nearly jogging, and the corridor responded by becoming impossibly long, the elevator at the end receding like something from a nightmare where the more you chase it, the further away it gets. He gave up on the elevator and looked for the stairwell, remembering there had been a door marked with an exit sign somewhere along this hallway, but he couldn't find it. Every door was a room number, no exits, no emergency stairwells, just an endless sequence of guest rooms that got more and more wrong the longer he looked at them. Some of the numbers were in languages he didn't recognize. Some were symbols that looked ancient and deliberate, and one door had no number at all, just a smear of what looked like old blood in the shape of a handprint. Michael turned away from the door and found himself facing a section of corridor he was certain he hadn't walked through before, a stretch where the wallpaper pattern was different, more aggressive, the vines looking more like grasping hands. The elevator finally appeared ahead of him, the brass cage doors gleaming in the dim light, and Michael ran the last few yards and pulled the outer door open, then yanked the interior gate aside and stepped into the small wooden car. He pressed the button for the ground floor, for the lobby where there would be people and light and rationality. But when the elevator started moving, he watched through the gate as the floor numbers changed on the indicator above the door. 2nd floor, 3rd floor, 4th floor, the numbers climbing even though he had pressed the button to go down. The elevator stopped on the 4th floor, the doors opened automatically, and Michael looked out at a corridor that was even darker than the one he had just left, the air thick with the smell of mildew and decay. He didn't step out, pressing the ground floor button again, repeatedly, desperately, when the elevator doors finally closed. This time the car descended, or at least the sensation of movement suggested descent, but the floor indicator didn't change, staying locked on 4 no matter how long the journey lasted. When the doors opened again, Michael found himself on what the indicator claimed was the ground floor, but he knew immediately it was wrong. The corridor he was looking at was identical to the one outside his room, the same wallpaper and carpet and sconces, but the numbers on the doors were different, starting at 100 instead of 200. Michael stepped out because staying in the elevator felt more dangerous than exploring, and he walked along this new hallway looking for any sign of the lobby or a way out. He found room 112, which should have been directly below his room 212, and the door was ajar. Michael approached slowly, his instinct screaming at him not to look inside, but his need to understand what was happening overriding caution. He pushed the door open wider and looked into the room, and what he saw made his legs weak. The room was laid out exactly like his room on the second floor. Same furniture placement, same bedspread, same view through the window. But it was wrong, in small, terrible ways. The bed was made, but there were impressions in the blankets, as if multiple people had been lying there, impressions that didn't match human proportions. The walls were covered in photographs, hundreds of them, all showing the same thing. Guests who had stayed in this hotel over the decades, their faces pale and frightened, their images captured in corridors and rooms that looked like the ones Michael was walking through now. And in every photograph, in the background just barely visible, there were figures that didn't look quite human, tall and thin with features that were blurred or distorted. Michael backed away from the door, turned to run, and slammed directly into someone standing behind him. He screamed and fell backward, landing hard on the carpet, and looked up at the person he had collided with. It was a hotel staff member, an older man in the uniform of a maintenance worker, and he was looking down at Michael with an expression of pity mixed with resignation. The maintenance worker helped Michael to his feet and spoke in heavily accented English, asking if Michael was American. When Michael nodded, unable to form words, the man sighed and said that the old wing of the hotel had a problem with Americans specifically, that for reasons no one understood, foreign guests from the United States seemed to trigger some kind of response from the building, causing the corridors to shift and rooms to disappear or appear in places they shouldn't exist. The worker explained that the hotel had been built on land that had a complicated history, that before the Dutch constructed the building, the site had been used for purposes that were never properly recorded, but that local folklore suggested were connected to death and judgment, some kind of colonial-era prison or execution ground. The spirits that remained were angry and territorial, but they followed rules that didn't always make sense, and one of those rules seemed to be that they paid particular attention to Americans. Perhaps because Americans reminded them of the colonial powers that had built the hotel in the first place. The maintenance worker said that Michael needed to return to his original room, that the corridor would let him back once he understood he was being tested, that the hotel wanted to see if he would panic or if he would accept the situation with grace. Michael wanted to argue, wanted to demand to be let out immediately, but the worker's expression told him that fighting would only make things worse. The man led him back to the elevator, pressed the button for the second floor, and told Michael to walk directly to room 212 without looking at any of the other doors, without counting, without trying to understand the geometry. Just walk and believe he would arrive. Michael did as instructed, stepping out of the elevator when it opened on the second floor and walking down the hallway with his eyes fixed on the carpet ahead of him. He didn't look at the doors, didn't try to count or measure or make sense of the distances. He simply walked, and after what felt like both seconds and hours, he found himself standing in front of room 212. The key card worked on the first try, and Michael stumbled into his room and locked the door behind him, his hand shaking so badly he could barely work the deadbolt. He sat on the bed and tried to process what had just happened, tried to convince himself it had been a hallucination brought on by exhaustion or food poisoning, but the rational explanations wouldn't take hold. He knew what he had experienced was real, that the hotel had tested him in some way, and he had barely passed. He didn't sleep that night, sitting fully dressed on top of the covers with all the lights on, and when dawn finally came, he packed his belongings with frantic speed and checked out at the front desk. The clerk who processed his early departure was the same one who had asked him about his room the previous day, and the man's expression was knowing as he processed the checkout, as if he had seen this scene many times before. Michael asked if other guests had complained about the second floor, about the corridors and the elevator, and the clerk said carefully that the hotel had a reputation for being atmospheric, that sensitive guests sometimes experienced things that were difficult to explain. He didn't elaborate, and Michael didn't push, just took his receipt and walked out into the morning sunshine feeling like he had escaped something that would have trapped him if he had stayed one more night. He left Bandung that day, cutting short his planned 3-night stay and heading to a more modern city where the hotels were new and the corridors stayed the same length, regardless of time of day. But the experience haunted him. The memory of those stretching hallways and the room full of photographs and the maintenance workers' resigned expression. Michael began researching the Hotel Majapahit when he returned to San Francisco, digging through old travel reviews and blog posts, and he found references scattered across years of internet history to similar experiences, always involving American tourists, always involving the second floor or the phantom first floor that appeared in the elevator. Some people dismissed them as attention-seeking or creative writing, but Michael recognized the details that matched his own experience too closely to be coincidence. The hotel was still operating, still taking reservations, and nowhere on their website or booking platforms was there any mention of the old wing or the corridors that moved or the tests that the building administered to certain guests. Michael saved all his research in a folder on his computer, part evidence and part warning, though he knew most people who read it would never believe him. And sometimes, late at night, he would dream of walking through those hallways again. But in the dreams, he never found his room, never reached an exit, just walked forever through shifting corridors while figures that weren't quite human watched from doorways that appeared and disappeared with every step he took. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. If you enjoyed these stories, feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. And if you want to, there's a link to buy me a coffee in the description too. Thank you for listening and wish you all the best. The horror of spaces that change without permission is one thing, but there's another kind of violation that's perhaps even more disturbing. The realization that your own body, your own shadow, the most fundamental representation of your physical presence in the world, is no longer entirely under your control. In Taiwan's night markets, where lights blaze bright against the darkness and crowds move in constant flow, this particular horror has found a home. Brandon Lee was in his second semester studying Mandarin at National Sun Yat-sen University in Kaohsiung when he decided to explore the city's famous night markets more thoroughly than he had before. He was 23, originally from Austin, and he had come to Taiwan on a scholarship program that combined language study with cultural immersion. The night markets were a regular part of his routine, places to practice his language skills and eat cheaply. But on this particular Friday evening in March, Brandon was going alone for the first time since arriving in Taiwan 4 months earlier. His usual group of friends had scattered for the weekend, some traveling to Taipei, others staying in to study for midterms, and Brandon decided he didn't want to waste a beautiful evening sitting in his dorm room. He took the bus to Liuhe Night Market, one of the most popular in the city, arriving just after dark when the stalls were fully set up and the crowds were beginning to build. The market was a sensory assault in the best way, the smell of grilled seafood and stinky tofu mixing with the calls of vendors and the press of bodies moving through the narrow aisles between stalls. Brandon bought some barbecue skewers and a bubble tea and wandered through the market with no particular destination in mind, just absorbing the energy and the chaos and feeling grateful to be in a place so different from anything in his previous life. He was perhaps halfway through the market, standing near a stall selling fried squid and watching the vendor work, when he noticed something odd about the shadows on the ground. The market was lit by strings of bright bulbs overhead, harsh white light that cast sharp shadows from everything and everyone beneath them, and Brandon had unconsciously been watching the shadows move as people walked past, the way they stretched and compressed with the changing angles of light. But one shadow near him wasn't moving correctly. It belonged to an elderly woman standing a few feet away looking at phone cases, and while the woman was facing the stall and standing still, her shadow was moving, shifting its weight from foot to foot as if dancing or nervous. Brandon blinked and looked again, thinking his eyes were playing tricks, or that he had misidentified which shadow belonged to whom. But as he watched more carefully, he saw it again. The woman's shadow moved independently, turning its head when the woman's head was still, gesturing with arms that the woman kept at her sides. Brandon felt a chill despite the warmth of the evening, and he looked down at his own shadow, checking that it was behaving normally. It was, following his movements perfectly, and he laughed quietly at himself for being spooked by a trick of the light or maybe exhaustion from too many late nights studying. He moved deeper into the market, stopping at various stalls to look at clothing and souvenirs, and slowly he became aware that the shadow problem wasn't isolated to that one woman. Other shadows around him were acting strangely, subtle enough that most people wouldn't notice, but obvious once you started looking. A man's shadow walked backward while the man walked forward, perfectly synchronized but reversed. A child's shadow was twice as tall as it should be, elongated beyond what the angle of the overhead lights could explain. And one shadow moved from person to person, sliding across the ground like it was searching for its proper owner, pausing at each individual before moving on. Brandon stopped walking and stood still, watching the shadows more carefully than the people, and he felt his stomach begin to tighten with unease. Something was fundamentally wrong here, some violation of natural law that nobody else seemed to notice or care about. He pulled out his phone and started taking photos, trying to capture what he was seeing, thinking that maybe the camera would show him he was imagining things, or maybe it would provide evidence that something genuinely strange was happening. He took a dozen shots of the crowd, of the stalls, of the overhead lights, and then he made the mistake of turning on his camera's selfie mode to take a picture of himself with the market in the background. The image on his screen showed him clearly, his face and the crowd behind him, and the bright lights overhead, but his shadow on the ground was wrong. It was facing him, turned 180 degrees from where it should be, and as Brandon watched in frozen horror, the shadow raised one hand in a slow wave. Brandon wasn't waving, wasn't moving at all except for the trembling in his hands, but the shadow gestured at him as if greeting or beckoning. He lowered the phone, looked down at the ground where his actual shadow fell, and saw that it was normal, properly aligned with his body and the light source. But when he raised the phone again and looked at the screen, the shadow was still wrong, still facing him, still waving. Brandon felt dizzy, the noise of the market becoming muffled and distant as his vision narrowed. He backed away from where he was standing, turned, and started walking quickly toward the market's exit, pushing through the crowd with his heart pounding and his breath coming fast. He needed to get out, needed to be away from these lights and these impossible shadows, needed to find somewhere quiet where he could think and figure out what was happening. But as he walked, he became aware that his shadow was following him, which was normal. Shadows followed their owners, except his shadow was doing more than following. It was keeping pace beside him rather than behind him, matching his stride, and when he glanced down, he saw it turn its head to look at him. Brandon broke into a run, not caring how crazy he looked, and burst out of the market onto a side street where the lighting was less intense. Just occasional street lamps instead of the market's blazing bulbs. He stopped under one of the lamps, breathing hard, and looked at his shadow. It was normal again, properly positioned behind him, falling across the pavement in the direction away from the light source. Brandon pulled out his phone with shaking hands and scrolled through the photos he had taken in the market, and what he saw made him feel physically ill. In every photo, multiple shadows were misaligned or behaving strangely, and in 3 of the images, there were shadows that had no corresponding people. Dark, human-shaped silhouettes lying on the ground or standing against walls with nobody casting them. And in the selfie he had taken, the shadow facing him and waving was clearly visible, indisputable in the frozen image, evidence that what he had seen was real and not a hallucination. Brandon deleted the photo immediately, not wanting to look at it anymore, but the damage was done. He knew now that something was deeply wrong with the night market, that the shadows there were alive in some way, or controlled by something that existed outside normal perception, and he had been noticed by whatever force managed them. The shadows wave hadn't been a greeting, it had been a recognition, an acknowledgement that Brandon had seen what he shouldn't have seen. He didn't go back to the market that night. walking instead to a convenience store blocks away where he sat in the harsh fluorescent lighting and tried to calm down. The lights inside the store were bright and flat, creating multiple weak shadows that overlapped and canceled each other out, and Brandon found that comforting. The absence of a single strong shadow, meaning there was nothing distinct for him to watch and fear. He bought a coffee he didn't drink and sat at the plastic table near the window for over an hour, watching people walk past outside and checking their shadows obsessively, looking for any sign of the wrongness he had witnessed at the market. Everyone's shadows seemed normal, and gradually Brandon convinced himself that what he had experienced was somehow localized to that specific night market. Maybe to all night markets, some phenomenon connected to the intense artificial lighting and the dense crowds and the energy of commercial activity that happened after dark. He could avoid night markets. That was easy enough. There were plenty of other places to eat and shop and experience Taiwanese culture. He finished his coffee, threw the cup away, and headed back to his dorm, taking the bus and then walking the last few blocks through the quiet campus. His shadow under the street lamps was perfectly normal, and by the time he reached his dorm room, Brandon was beginning to think that maybe he had overreacted, that whatever he had seen could be explained or rationalized or at least forgotten. But the next morning when he woke up and got out of bed, his shadow was wrong. He noticed it immediately as he walked to the bathroom, the way his shadow on the wall was moving slightly faster than he was, reaching the doorway a fraction of a second before his body did. Brandon stopped moving and his shadow stopped too, but there was a delay, barely perceptible, but definitely there, as if the shadow was receiving commands on a slight lag. He spent the morning testing it, moving quickly and then stopping, turning in circles, raising his arms, and each time the shadow was just slightly out of sync, matching his movements, but not perfectly, like a video with audio delay. No one else seemed to notice. His roommate walked past him in the hallway and didn't react. Other students in the dining hall didn't stare or point, and Brandon realized that the desynchronization was subtle enough that only someone looking for it would see it. But he saw it constantly, couldn't stop seeing it. The way his shadow led him instead of following, the way it sometimes gestured when his hands were still, the way it turned its head to look at things he wasn't looking at. He skipped classes that day, unable to concentrate on anything except his shadow, and he spent hours researching online, trying to find explanations or similar experiences. He found old folklore about shadows having their own consciousness, Japanese stories about the doppelganger, European tales of shadowless men who had sold their souls, but nothing that exactly matched what was happening to him. The closest he came was a forum post in traditional Chinese that he struggled to translate using online tools, something about Kaohsiung's night markets being built on land that had once been a cemetery, and about how the displaced spirits sometimes attached themselves to visitors by inhabiting their shadows. Brandon tried everything he could think of to fix the problem. He avoided bright light, thinking that weak shadows might behave better, but his shadow was wrong even in dim rooms with barely any illumination. He tried standing in places with no shadow at all, directly under overhead lights where the shadow fell beneath him invisible. But as soon as he moved away, the shadow returned, and it was still wrong. He went to a temple and bought protective talismans that the vendor promised would ward off evil spirits, wearing them around his neck and keeping them in his pockets. But his shadow remained desynchronized. After 3 days of barely eating or sleeping, obsessively watching his own reflection in shadow, and growing increasingly paranoid that the wrongness was getting worse, Brandon broke down and told one of his Taiwanese classmates what was happening. The classmate, a woman named Mei, who had been friendly and helpful since Brandon arrived in Kaohsiung, listened to his story with an expression that shifted from skepticism to concern. She asked him which night market he had been to and what time he had been there, and when he told her, she nodded slowly and said that he wasn't the first person to report this kind of experience. She knew of at least 2 other foreign students in recent years who had complained about their shadows acting strangely after visiting certain night markets, and both had eventually left Taiwan because the problem didn't stop and the psychological toll became too much. May took Brandon to meet an older woman who lived near the university, someone May's grandmother knew and who supposedly had experience with spiritual matters. The woman listened to Brandon's story, examined his shadow carefully while he stood in her small living room, and then told him through May's translation that his shadow had been noticed by something that existed in the spaces between the living world and the spirit world, something that fed on attention and fear. By noticing the shadows at the night market, by photographing them and acknowledging their wrongness, Brandon had made himself visible to this entity, and it had marked him by partially claiming his shadow. The shadow would continue to act independently, growing more autonomous over time, and eventually it might separate from him entirely, leaving him shadowless or worse, leaving him trapped while his shadow went out into the world wearing his face. The woman said there were rituals that might help, ceremonies that could strengthen the bond between a person and their shadow, but they required materials and time and expertise that she didn't have. She recommended that Brandon leave Taiwan, return to America where the entity's influence would be weaker, and hope the distance would eventually restore the proper relationship between him and his shadow. Brandon asked how long it would take, and the woman shrugged, saying it could be months or years or never, that some people carried the mark forever. Brandon made the decision to leave within a week, withdrawing from his program early and booking a flight home despite the financial penalty and the academic consequences. His parents were confused and worried when he called to tell them, unable to understand why their son was suddenly abandoning an opportunity he had been excited about for so long. But Brandon couldn't explain in terms that would make sense to them. He told them he was homesick, that the cultural adjustment had been harder than expected, and they accepted it even though they clearly suspected there was more to the story. The last few days in Kaohsiung were nightmarish. Brandon's shadow was now moving independently for seconds at a time, turning to watch people who walked past him, reaching for things Brandon wasn't reaching for. And once he woke up in the middle of the night to find his shadow standing in the corner of his room, even though he was lying down in bed and there was no light source that could create a shadow in that location. He stopped sleeping with the lights off, stopped looking at reflective surfaces, stopped going outside unless absolutely necessary. When he finally boarded the plane to leave Taiwan, sitting in his window seat and watching Kaohsiung fall away below him, he felt a mixture of relief and profound loss, grief for the experience he was abandoning, and terror that he was bringing something home with him that he couldn't control or understand. The flight was long and uncomfortable, and Brandon spent most of it with his eyes closed, not sleeping, but avoiding looking at his shadow on the seat beside him, that occasionally moved when he was sitting still. Back in Austin, in the familiar environment of his childhood home, Brandon's shadow slowly improved. The desynchronization became less noticeable over weeks and then months, the movements matching more closely, the independent gestures becoming rare instead of constant. But it never fully recovered. Even now, years later, Brandon sometimes catches his shadow doing things he didn't do, small gestures or movements that are just slightly off, and he has learned to live with it the way people learn to live with chronic pain or tinnitus. A constant low-level awareness of something being wrong that never quite goes away. He never returned to Taiwan, never finished his Mandarin studies, and he never told anyone except May the full truth of why he left. The photos he took in the night market are gone, deleted from his phone and his cloud storage, but the memory of what he saw remains vivid and detailed. The shadows that walked backward and the shadow that waved at him, and the terrible understanding that there are entities that exist in the spaces between light and dark that notice when they're being noticed. And sometimes, in bright sunlight when his shadow is sharp and clear on the pavement, Brandon sees it turn its head to look at something behind him, and when he turns around to see what it's looking at, there's nothing there. Just empty space and the fading impression of something that exists only in shadow, something that marked him years ago in a night market in Kaohsiung, and that still maintains its claim through the connection to his shadow that will never be fully severed. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. If you enjoyed these stories, feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. And if you want to, there's a link to buy me a coffee in the description too. Thank you for listening and wish you all the best.